So one of the top topics, of course, related to Ukraine is what is happening right now in Kyiv. Sorry, not in Kyiv. The Southeast Europe Summit is taking place in Odessa. This event was attended by the leadership of Greece, Croatia, and Montenegro. The Prime Minister of Greece, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and the Prime Minister of Croatia, Andrej Plenković, together with the President of Montenegro, Jakov Milatovic, were in Odessa at the Ukraine Southeast Europe Summit. Similarly, for the first time since the full-scale invasion, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić arrived in Ukraine, who, well, is called pro-Russian in many ways, and not without reason. He came to Ukraine. Moreover, Vučić stated that Serbia is ready to provide support to Ukraine and to take part in Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. At the same time, official Belgrade emphasized that it supports Ukraine's territorial integrity. But Vučić did not sign the Ukraine Southeast Europe Summit declaration, which condemns Russian aggression. He explained this by disagreeing with the clause calling for new sanctions against Russia. Well, that's how it is. On the one hand, he came to Ukraine, took part in the summit, supports territorial integrity, and Belgrade is ready to participate in reconstruction and to ensure that Serbian legal entities, firms, and companies can take part in rebuilding Ukraine. On the one hand, after the war, our cities. On the other hand, we see that, unfortunately, Vučić did not sign the declaration, which unequivocally condemns Russian aggression and demands sanctions. Because sanctions are, in general, one of the ways to bring the aggressor to justice, and in international law, this is for an international offense. So, Russia has trampled on the norms of international law. Obviously, they need to be held accountable for this. And overall, the question arises, one that I have been thinking about for quite some time, regarding the recognition of Kosovo's independence. And when we talk about Kosovo, yes, you can go ahead and tell me about it. I remember that many people, even 2 years ago, were raising this issue and writing in the comments that it shouldn't be done because it would be a violation and because it would then set a precedent regarding Crimea. But I just want to remind you that Kosovo was granted the right to independence according to a special decision of the International Court of Justice of the UN, so there is no violation there at all. Therefore, if Vučić raises the issue that the final declaration shouldn't be signed there and so on, then perhaps the question of recognizing Kosovo's independence should be raised. But again, at the same time, we see that representatives from the Balkans visited Ukraine. That's a good thing. We need to develop relations with all regions to participate in various initiatives, especially when they are supported by our European partners. But of course, they also need to be, let's say, effective. Meanwhile, on the night of June 11th, Ukrainian drones attacked the Tambov gunpowder plant in the city of Kotovsk, Tambov region. Local residents report numerous explosions. According to local residents, at least 15 explosions were heard over Kotovsk. Air raid sirens sounded in the city. The acting governor of the Tambov region, Evgeny Pirvishev, confirmed the drone attack on Kotovsk. So, what kind of confirmation can representatives of the Russian authorities provide? That's right. Operation Debris. They always say that these are not drones, that it's nothing serious, it's all just debris that causes only minor damage. And Pirvishev is no exception, who stated that as a result of the fall of one of the downed UAV share, it's not just debris, but debris from a downed UAV fire broke out, which was extinguished by firefighters. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, during the night, Russian air defense allegedly intercepted 32 drones. As for the Tambov gunpowder plant, it is one of the largest enterprises specializing in the production of ammunition and gunpowder for small arms, artillery systems, grenade launchers, mortars, and tank charges and shells. The plant also manufactures components of explosives, in particular nitrocellulose and collodion. Since March 2023, the enterprise has been under sanctions. Well, under sanctions, obviously, but it is under the sanctions of the defense forces of Ukraine. And later, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed that the Tambov gunpowder plant was struck by Ukrainian drone systems. In addition, Explosions were recorded in the areas of the ammunition depot of the 106th Airborne Division in the Kursk region. And at the depot, at the Buturlinovka airfield in the Voronezh region, in other words, our units are working, the drone forces are working, intelligence is working, and the security service of Ukraine is working. All of this is done so that, let's say, our operations are more successful, so that we can strike enemy targets in various ways and bring the war onto Russian territory. This is what the president is talking about when he mentions our strategy. Volodymyr Zelenskyy has spoken about this in all of his interviews, and this is clearly evident now. But of course, in order for these operations to be more successful, in order for them to be more effective, we cannot do without assistance. We understand this. We need to build up our own capabilities and capacities, but still, it is very difficult to do this without partners. This, it must be admitted, is practically impossible in some areas and by certain parameters. And for example, there is information that we have partners who are quite, who are quite actively supporting Ukraine and, well, really standing behind us. These are, in particular, the countries of Northern Europe. And here's some news. Norway has delivered more fighter jets to Ukraine than was publicly reported. By the way, this also relates to the issue of weapons. Quite often we discuss and debate how much weaponry has already been received. Sometimes it was announced somewhere, sometimes the media reported it, sometimes there were some figures and so on. Very often we don't know the real quantities, and that's a good thing, because it's motivated by security realities. It's motivated by the fact that not everything can be disclosed. It's motivated by the fact that certain information, a large portion of information, should be released with a delay, so that, for example, it's not possible to track the delivery of weapons almost in real time in order to avoid disrupting logistics, destroying anything, and so on. So Norway has delivered more fighter jets to Ukraine than was previously reported. Ukraine received more than twice as many fighter jets as was officially announced. The report mentions intentions to deliver 14 F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, whereas official sources, so official statements, were limited to 6 to 14 aircraft. The document does not specify the condition of the 8 additional sites. It is possible that these are non-operational aircraft intended for training ground personnel, dismantling for spare parts, or use as decoy mock-ups. The United States has also supplied similar modified aircraft. This hypothesis is partially supported by statements from representatives of the Norwegian government, who previously noted that only operational aircraft withdrawn from service are being prepared for the armed forces of Ukraine. At the same time, it is not ruled out that some F-16s could still have been transferred and could have been restored to operational condition. Well, everything is important here, everything matters. And spare parts, if not all, are important, and for training personnel, where should technical personnel, especially those servicing the aircraft, be trained. And not only that, the more we work, the more we transition to new standards, the more trained, professional and skilled personnel we will have aviation technicians, pilots who are actively working. And a recent confirmation of this is the downing of a Russian Su-35 aircraft in the skies over the Kursk region. So, as a result, we are seeing the outcomes that we have now. Also, Britain will provide Ukraine with £1.7 billion sterling for additional arms purchases. Ukraine will receive nearly £1.7 billion from the United Kingdom to purchase weaponry. This decision was made at a government meeting, Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal reported. So with this money, it is planned to purchase British Rapid Ranger surface-to-air missile systems and lightweight multipurpose Martlet missiles, which will strengthen Ukraine's air defense. This month, the UK also announced a record amount of aid for the supply of drones. We're talking about £350 million sterling, which will allow 100,000 drones to be delivered to Ukraine this year, the Prime Minister noted. So, we can see that the work is ongoing. It is quite comprehensive. It involves both the purchase of, aircraft with funds provided by our international partners, as well as the joint production and manufacturing of weaponry, which is, as you can imagine, extremely important. And, in fact, Donald Trump has once again come onto the scene, making his presence felt. We can't help but mention him here because he gave a comment to the New York Post This is an American publication, a tabloid for influential conservatives, where he stated that during a phone conversation on June 4, he discussed the issue of resolving the situation in Ukraine with Putin. By the way, regarding June 4, let me remind you that literally the day before, the 2 weeks that Trump had given Putin had just ended. Once again, another 2 weeks during which something was supposed to happen but didn't specifically. Russia was supposed to demonstrate certain steps toward the ceasefire and a willingness to continue the dialogue. Well, as for the willingness to continue the dialogue, of course, they can always pull the usual trick and try to claim that they are ready. As if to say, it's Ukraine that is dragging things out. Again, they might not promise that they'll come to Istanbul almost the very next day or week and wait for the Ukrainian delegation to continue negotiations. But the situation, whether on the battlefield, in Ukrainian airspace, or in statements from Russian representatives, does not indicate that Russia is inclined toward peace. On the battlefield, we see that the enemy is trying to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region, and they are already in close proximity. They are already attempting to send their sabotage and reconnaissance groups into the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. Our forces continue their containment operation. They are operating in the Sumy region. Well, regarding the Dnipropetrovsk region, it's important to understand that this is less of a military action and more of a military propaganda move. In other words, it's important for the Russians to try to demoralize us, to divide us, to sow discord. It's important for the Russians to try to break us. That's why, of course, they will now be especially active in spreading news in the information space, claiming that they are supposedly already marching in columns through the Dnipropetrovsk region and further west, directly towards Dnipro. So it's also important to stay vigilant, verify information accordingly, and understand that the enemy is not being allowed to gain a foothold there right now. In the air, we are seeing constant attacks, and the same is reflected in statements from Russian officials. For example, Medinsky, the representative of the Russian delegation during the negotiations in Istanbul, said that the Russians are demanding strikes on Ukrainian arms suppliers. In other words, they are demanding blood as an act of revenge, supposedly in response to the spiderweb special operation and so on. Well, in this sense, the Wall Street Journal writes that the head of the Russian delegation at the negotiations in Istanbul, Medinsky, compared the war between Russia and Ukraine to the conflict between an older and younger brother. The assistant to the Russian dictator compared the war between Russia and Ukraine to a conflict between brothers. The Russian politician is convinced that the West's main mistake is viewing the war in Ukraine as something similar to the conflict between England and France, as if these were two countries with their own separate histories and cultures. Meanwhile, Medinsky pointed out that the war with Ukraine is a fratricidal struggle between two states with a common language and culture, who are essentially one people and are destined to be close allies. It is like a conflict between two brothers, the elder and the younger, over who is smarter and more important. Unfortunately, this conflict deepens our differences, and that is why we want it to end as soon as possible. This was stated by Medinsky, and he said that Russia is supposedly ready for peace, but if Ukraine continues further, then Russia will be forced to respond. And once again, he cited the example of Russia's war with Sweden, which took place in the 18th century and lasted for a long time. Well, in fact, everything is clear. Medinsky is working for propaganda. He is actively spreading the narrative to the West that there is no supposedly independent Ukraine, but rather one big fraternal nation. Right now, there is discord between them and so on. So this is purely informational propaganda. But it's important to understand that this is being described by the Wall Street Journal. So after all, it is making its way into the media. And in one way or another, even like this, Russia is trying to achieve its goals in the information space by spreading exactly this kind of information. But again, it must be said that compared to how events unfolded starting from 2014, when this large-scale war began, when Russia annexed Crimea, and now, thank God, including thanks to the work of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President of Ukraine Zelenskyy, his administration, representatives of the government, the entire civil society, and of course the armed forces of Ukraine. Well, now Russian narratives are mentioned far less frequently. Still, it has been possible to change them. If even Vučić has come to Kyiv, that already means a lot. And besides, by the way, it also means a lot that Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, responded to Volodymyr Zelenskyy's interview with the Hungarian media. So you see just how much they actually fear Zelenskyy, they fear his interviews. Sorry, but almost immediately they rush to justify themselves and quickly tell their own version of the events. Essentially, Orbán stated that Zelenskyy lashed out at Hungary because, in his view, we simply don't want to die for Ukraine, and we don't want our children to return from the front to the throne. The Hungarian Prime Minister responded. In his opinion, Zelenskyy almost attacked Hungary by criticizing the country. However, Hungarians do not want to die for Ukraine. Zelenskyy never called for that. The issue was about something completely different. Meanwhile, the State Department condemns the strikes. The State Department condemns Russia's strikes on Ukraine and demands that they stop. I don't think this will actually stop Putin in any serious way. But such calls do exist. Elon Musk partially apologized to Trump for being too harsh. This indicates that this round goes to Trump, and either Musk was advised or he realized himself that Trump still has more levers of influence over the situation as president than Elon Musk does. So for now, this round of state versus corporations, or corporations versus the state, goes to the state. Let's see how events will unfold further. And the Washington Post has published an article stating that as early as this week, the administration of US President Trump, without notifying the governments of other countries, may begin transferring potentially thousands of foreigners who are illegally in the United States to the Guantanamo military base. The foreign nationals being considered for transfer come from various countries. Among them are hundreds from friendly European nations, including the United Kingdom, Italy, France, Germany, Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Lithuania, Poland, Turkey, and Ukraine. Officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, told the publication that the Trump administration is unlikely to notify the governments of the countries from which the foreign nationals originate about the upcoming transfers to Guantanamo. Preparations include medical examinations of 9,000 people to determine whether they are healthy enough to be sent to Guantanamo. It is far from clear whether these facilities can accommodate 9,000 detainees, which would mean a significant increase in the number of migrants compared to the few hundred who have been transferred to and from the base since the beginning of this year. Guantanamo is an infamous prison associated with investigations into cases of torture, violence, and so on during the Iraq campaign. And these are clearly unfriendly actions towards Europe and among others towards Ukraine, clearly unfriendly. And by the way, this is quite a drastic step. It should not be underestimated. It once again demonstrates Trump's migration policy and, among other things, could intensify protests against Trump. The situation there is very serious. Many people are protesting and intend to continue protesting. Well, and the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, is reportedly preparing to replace the head of the German Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, and it is likely that this position will be taken by Martin Jäger, who is currently the German ambassador to Ukraine. I have the honor of knowing him personally. He is quite an informed and professional individual. So what does this indicate? It shows that, despite everything, the deep state remains the deep state. It shapes its policy in such a way as to address where the threat comes from.